Okay, I'll be the first to say this scenario sounds very out of pocket in my opinion, but I randomly thought of this and thought it might be interesting to tackle despite that rivalry between the lions and the wolves in the canon timeline. Ned and Cersei definitely don't seem like the type that would ever get together on their own, but as outlandish of a pair as this seems, I think I can come up with some way that these two can get together. It honestly may not be the best match considering their personalities, but it's interesting and I'm willing to go out on a limb and try something out here. So, what if in some cosmic change of events, instead of one day becoming the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms and marrying Robert Baratheon, Cersei Lannister married his best friend, Eddard Stark, and became the Lady of Winterfell instead. Now, as I said, I think this is going to be an interesting topic of discussion. Unlike many of my what-ifs, there isn't an in-world pre-existing connection that could make this scenario possible. A great example of what I'm getting at here are my what if Jaime married Lysa and Catelyn Tully videos. There's already an existing foundation in those stories before the changes are made that makes said changes more plausible in the long run and only requires some minor tweaks. The pre-existing foundation I'm talking about in those videos is Tywin looking for a Tully match, so it's not that outlandish for Jaime to get in these scenarios where he has to marry a Tully woman. That isn't exactly the case here. As you all know, if you've been keeping up with my channel, I like to find reasoning for my changes that make sense in the world and for the characters. Now, lacking a pre-existing connection with Cersei and Ned to help come up with valid reasoning for my changes isn't the biggest workaround that I'd have to do here. There are just some questions I need to start asking. The first one being, in what world would Ned and Cersei ever end up getting together? As I said earlier in the video, seeing who they were in canon, they would likely never get together willingly, but that's an easy thing to figure out for me. I think the best way to go about a potential Ned and Cersei relationship is to rewind the clock a bit to before the events of Robert's Rebellion when they were younger. During these early days, before the king was burning his vassals alive and inciting war, there were a couple marriage proposals that were offered by some of the more prominent families in Westeros. Eddard Stark set up a match between his oldest son Brandon and a young Catelyn Tully. Tywin Lannister tried setting up his son Jaime with a young Lysa Tully, which didn't work out because he got named to the Kingsguard, and when that deal failed, he tried to offer Tyrion to Lysa instead, but Hoster Tully was not a fan of that idea and shut it down pretty quickly. Tywin also tried to marry his daughter Cersei off to the crown prince, Rhaegar Targaryen. But Aerys also wasn't a fan of that match either. So the point I'm getting at here is that this is a moment in time where all these big families are looking for suitable partners for their children. Marriages and legacies are set in stone during this time period. So if we want Ned and Cersei to get together, I think this is when it needs to happen, when their parents are actively trying to make these alliances. But it does beg the question, would Tywin even be interested in a Stark match to begin with? I think it's not out of the realm of possibility. After all, he wanted a marriage pact with the Tullys in the books. I don't think it's ever explained why he wanted the Tullys, but I doubt it was some grand reason, like the Tullys having money or soldiers or some kind of advantage that the Westerlands can use. It could simply be that the Tullys are a major family in Westeros whose territory neighbors his own, and they have daughters of a similar age to his son and heir who will need heirs of his own one day. Furthering the legacy is a good enough reason, along with building favorable connections with another family. This could also be translated to the Starks. The North is the biggest kingdom in the realm, and so big and so cold that invasion is nigh impossible. The Starks are also a high-profile family who are widely respected by their own vassals. It makes sense that Tywin could be interested in a match like this as long as he sees some form of advantage for himself and his family. Like in the show, how he tries to marry off Tyrion to Sansa to secure the North and Cersei Dolores to secure the Tyrell alliance. In those instances, he gained something, and here, his daughter could be the Lady of Winterfell one day. So, that being said, the match is very possible, but we need to get to a place where it comes to fruition, considering certain canon factors. For one, Cersei was pretty much off the market up until the rebellion was over when it came to marriage, since Tywin was planning to make Cersei queen by marrying her off to Prince Rhaegar ever since she was a child. Then the Starks weren't exactly looking for a marriage pact with the Lannisters to begin with. They wanted the Tullys. And even then when the Starks were looking for marriage prospects, that was more so for Brandon as the heir to Winterfell than Ned, who was a second son. There wouldn't be much advantage to Tywin marrying off his daughter to a man with nothing to gain. With that being said, say we change things up a bit here, starting with the Starks actually pursuing the Lannisters over the Tullys when it comes to marriage. It would definitely make a lot of sense for them to want to do, since Tywin is the hand of the king, head of the richest family in the realm, with a pretty big army. Who wouldn't want to get in with that guy? Maybe Rickard decides to hold off for a little while on trying to marry off Brandon, and they'll finally have the opportunity to get him with Cersei after the tourney of Harrenhal. I think this is a good point to make moves because I think this would be a time where Tywin could be more open to a marriage pact with the Starks, because it was around this time that Tywin endured a few losses that could have opened him up to the idea. He tried betrothing Cersei to Rhaegar only to get turned down by Aerys. He was going to make an alliance with the Tullys by marrying off Jaime, but then he got named to the Kingsguard, and in one move his marriage pact was voided and he lost his heir. Then he resigns as Hand of the King and goes back to Casterly Rock with his daughter, seemingly giving up on the Targaryens. He's been taking more than a few L's, and I think this is when I'll say the Starks make a proposition to Tywin for a match with Cersei. After being on the back foot for so many years, openly humiliated by his former friend Aerys, having been told he's nothing more than a servant despite running the kingdoms for Aerys, having his daughter rejected and his son taken to be a Kingsguard, he may be a little eager for some kind of win. The Starks aren't a bad family. As I said, they rule over one of the largest kingdoms in Westeros and are widely respected. They're a good family, and with his marriage pacts falling through with the Targaryens and the Tullys, he could be compelled to accept. Tywin is a man who cares about his legacy more than anything, and marrying Cersei off to a Stark wouldn't be the worst idea, especially if he was willing to marry Jaime to Lysa originally. Now, if we say that Tywin has given up on the Targaryens and isn't holding on to Cersei for some other match, then he will take up the offer of Rickard Stark. However, given how things went in canon, this Stark-Lannister match will be between Cersei and Ned's big brother Brandon and not Ned himself, as he is the heir to Winterfell and the one Rickard is trying to marry off right now. He'd also be the only one Tywin is interested in because nothing comes of his daughter marrying a second son with no inheritance. If she marries Ned right now, she's just some lady in the north. If she marries Brandon, she becomes the Lady of Winterfell and therefore a ruler of the north. She won't be a princess or a queen, but this is better than nothing. I doubt Cersei would be happy about the prospect of marrying a Stark and going to live in the north, though. It's big and cold and will likely be a far cry from the rich life that she's known at Casterly Rock and at court when her father was Hand. She's used to a lot of jewels and finery, but the north is a more rugged place and she'd have to adjust to it. In a way, it kind of reminds me of Jorah and his wife, Lynese Hightower, how he married her and took her to Bear Island, but the lifestyle of the north was so different from that of Old Town, it just wasn't enough for her. Not to mention, Cersei had this obsession with Rhaegar in the books, so to not only be turned down as a potential bride for him, and then being sent to the north, it wouldn't bode well. And that's not even mentioning that she would be even farther from her brother Jaime. She would feel like Tywin is punishing her for something, and this could breed resentment towards her father, not that he'll care, since as a Lannister she has a duty to the family. I think Cersei would be able to somewhat reconcile the idea of going to live in the north once she sees Brandon Stark, though. He is a fairly attractive dude and a great warrior. He's described as having wolf's blood. In canon, Cersei was attracted to a young Robert Baratheon and even looked forward to being his wife until he called her Lyanna on their wedding night. I think it'll be a bit of a repeat here, minus the whole whispering your dead love's name in your wife's ear. She doesn't like that she'll be living in the north, but having an attractive husband could somewhat make up for things. But this match is not one that's going to last. Things are going to kick off here like they did in the original timeline, regardless of who Cersei ends up with, since the Lannisters had no real effect on what led up to the rebellion. Rhaegar will still run off with Lyanna, leaving many to think that she was kidnapped by the Dragon Prince. In an attempt to get her back, her father Rickard and brother Brandon will go to King's Landing and confront the Mad King, who will see them as a threat once Brandon tells Rhaegar to come out and die. And then both Stark men will be killed. Now, with the loss of Lyanna and the deaths of two Starks, the rebellion kicks off, but before that, with the death of Brandon, Ned will now become the Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. This is important because in canon, this is the whole reason he ended up marrying Catelyn. She was supposed to marry his brother Brandon, and then he died. So to honor the alliance with the Tullys, he stepped up to marry her. The same will happen in this timeline, but instead of Catelyn, Ned steps up to marry Cersei, who wouldn't be too thrilled about marrying Ned if I'm going to be honest. She already doesn't want to go north, but that could have been somewhat bearable had she married Brandon, a handsome man and fearsome warrior instead of his more sullen, serious-looking brother. And this also comes from the books as well, because this was kind of Catelyn's thought process when she married Ned too. She was expecting a younger Brandon, and Ned wasn't that. He was different from his big bro, and it took her some time to actually fall in love with him. And knowing how superficial Cersei can be appearance-wise, this could turn her off further to a Stark marriage. Which is kind of funny because in A Game of Thrones, the books, after being confronted by Ned about sleeping with her brother, she actually tries to seduce him, saying that Catelyn is 1,000 leagues away, along with her brother Jaime, and that if he's kind to her, he won't regret it. all the while touching his leg, his face, his hair, the works. But that's more based on strategy than actual attraction on her part. Now, you may ask if Tywin would still go through with a Stark marriage, considering that Ned would effectively be a rebel to the crown, and I'm inclined to say he would, given that around this time he wasn't exactly a supporter of the Targaryens. For most of the rebellion, he was pretty much neutral and indifferent to the conflict until the very end when rebel victory was certain. I don't think he'd have an issue with the marriage in this instance, and to go with his mindset and what he's thinking here, I'd actually like to draw from canon again with the marriage of Tyrion and Sansa. This was his plan to secure the North. With Sansa being the last Stark around, if Tyrion had a child with her, then said child would be the heir to Winterfell through her. It could be a similar plan here. With Tywin being an opportunist and always going on about legacy, maybe he hopes that in the worst case scenario, if Ned dies, hopefully he would have gotten Cersei pregnant beforehand, like he did to Cat in canon when the rebellion started originally. And that child could be the next ruler of Winterfell. And Lannisters could effectively have control over the North. Now, as cool as that sounds for Tywin, there would still be some concern on his part, given that the marriage would have happened fairly early in the war, and he would have to consider what would happen if somehow Aerys did manage to win. Would he and the rest of his family be punished for not coming to the support of the royal family? Would Aerys, if he survived, see the act of letting Cersei marry Ned, a man trying to depose him, as an act of treason? And that could even get a bit more difficult if the rebels start asking him for support as well. Like Ned, he is his father-in-law now, so Ned coming to ask Tywin for help would make sense as the guy who married his daughter. But regardless of what goes through Tywin's mind about whether to help the crown or to help the rebels because of a marriage pact, I think he'll follow the same formula that he did in canon, ignoring all calls to arms until after the Battle of the Trident and the death of Prince Rhaegar. Now, before we get into the sack of King's Landing here, a question we need to ask really quickly is if the Tullys still support the Rebel Alliance in this timeline. In canon, what really bound the Tullys to the Rebel Alliance was the dual marriages between Ned and Jon to Catelyn and Lysa. With Ned marrying Cersei, Catelyn remains unwed, so that part of the alliance is gone now. However, I still think Jon will marry Lysa though. And yes, I say Lysa, not Catelyn, even though she's single, because there are a few factors that went into Lysa being married off to Jon in the first place. Hoster Tully was very ambitious, and Jon Arryn was desperate for an heir after his death during the Battle of the Bells. And Hoster thought Lysa would be perfect to give him a new heir, since she previously got pregnant with the child of Littlefinger. But her father made her drink moon tea to get rid of the baby. Now, I will say the only reason Lysa got pregnant is because she slept with Peter Baelish after Brandon Stark almost killed him in a duel. A duel which never would have happened in this timeline because Catelyn was never set to marry anyone, and therefore Peter had no one to challenge. So if Peter was never grievously injured, Lysa doesn't sleep with him, and therefore there may not even be a baby, and therefore proof that Lysa can give Jon Arryn an heir one day. But if I'm being honest, that's not really a big deal. She slept with Peter another time before that duel when he was really drunk at a party and thought she was her sister. We can just say that's when she gets pregnant, and the events continue as follows, with her father finding out, her drinking moon tea, and then getting married off to Jon Arryn. Or maybe to simplify it, Hoster is just ambitious and sees an opportunity to pawn off his kid, and does it. This match with the Aarons, who are steadfast supporters of the Starks and Baratheons during this time, would be more than enough to keep the Tullys in the fold, I would say. Moving on, the story goes about the same. Tywin will come in at the last minute to King's Landing and claim he wants to help the king and needs him to open the gates. Aerys will be very wary, more so than canon, because Tywin's daughter married Eddard Stark, one of the rebel leaders in this fight. He'll be convinced that this is a trick and that despite Tywin's lack of action, he's secretly in league with the rebels. The way I see things going here is that Pycelle once again gets in the ear of the Mad King, saying that the marriage was just Tywin doing his duty. The Stark-Lannister marriage was something that was promised before the war was even a prospect. Two families made an oath to each other and decided to fulfill it. Oaths are very important in Westeros, and he'll say that Tywin is just doing his duty as a vassal and coming to defend his king. After all, he was Aerys' loyal hand at one point. Why not trust him? This will give the king some incentive to open the gates for Tywin, and the city will then be sacked like normal. Elia will be killed by the Mountain along with her and Rhaegar's children. Aerys will be killed by Jaime after he demands the execution of the Wildfire plot, and then the rebels will arrive and Robert will take the Iron Throne. This would definitely be a very interesting confrontation for Ned when it comes to the Lannisters, because the deaths of Elia and her children are things that haunted him for years even after the rebellion was over. He had a disdain for the Lannisters because of what they did. Tywin for giving the order, Jaime for killing the king he swore to protect. But now, it's more complicated. Tywin is his father-in-law. Jaime is his brother-in-law. These aren't just some other lords. He would have beef with his wife's family. And I can only imagine how angry he would be here, maybe even more so than he was originally. Because if Tywin is his father-in-law, if he married his daughter Cersei, he would have most likely asked Tywin for help during all the fighting in the rebellion, only to have him refuse. And he didn't even side with the king, but pretended to stay neutral just to show up at the last minute to commit this atrocity. Ned's emotional state during this would be something else. And it gets even more complicated because he wants the Lannisters punished, but they're his wife's family too. So there is a bit of conflict on Ned's end for wanting to pursue justice against them given their familial ties, but I ultimately think that he will still tell Robert that they need to be punished, just like in canon. And they'll still get away with it because they wiped out Robert's competition. So there's still that strain with the Lannisters despite being married to one now. And while we're speaking of marriage, I think there's another important question we need to ask in regards to Robert Baratheon. As the new king, he is going to need a queen. This would have been Lyanna had she lived, and this would have also been Cersei if she was available. So with two of his primary options gone, who would be viable? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. Since she was left single in this timeline, I would dare to say that Catelyn Tully is the one who gets married to Robert Baratheon. With Lyanna and Cersei out of the way, she's the most viable candidate, and her father Hoster is ambitious. With a daughter who's old enough to be wed, he would not pass up the opportunity to marry her to the new king. So in this timeline, the partners of Ned and Robert just end up switching, which I find absolutely hilarious. This would honestly be a great match and a horrible one, to be honest. Great because Catelyn is a loyal, beautiful wife, and as we've seen, she has no issues having children, and isn't a cheater, so she would likely give Robert some legitimate Baratheon heirs. But this would be terrible, because if Catelyn was so upset about Jon being around, she would be in agony when it comes to Robert. He has kids scattered around the entire continent. Catelyn would not be happy with this level of infidelity, and not only that, I don't think she would even grow to love Robert the same way she did Ned. Not just because of the cheating, but because Robert wouldn't even be interested in trying to love her either. He'll still be obsessed with Lyanna to the point where he whispers her name to Catelyn on their wedding night, like he did to Cersei. Lyanna would be a constant presence that stops things from really moving forward between them, and Catelyn will have this constant feeling of not being good enough. Her husband is obsessed with a dead woman, and he keeps cheating on her. And things will probably get even worse if Robert brings Maya Stone to court, which is likely to happen now since Cersei's not here. For those who don't know, Maya Stone is the bastard daughter of Robert Baratheon, and she's one of his favorite children. He wanted to bring her to court in canon and raise her there, but Cersei threatened to kill Maya if he did that. Since she's not around, this may be different. Catelyn will definitely put up a fuss about a bastard living in the Red Keep with their family, but while she'll huff and puff about how unhappy she is, she won't go as far as to threaten to kill Robert's kid, if you ask me. So Maya Stone will likely come to live in King's Landing at some point instead of staying in the Vale. Moving on from that though, everything that happened with Ned in the Tower of Joy still occurs in this timeline. He'll still find Jon and take him back to Winterfell, and this proposes another issue regarding children. When Ned comes back to Winterfell, he'll pretend that Jon is his bastard son, and like Catelyn, Cersei hates bastards. She hated Robert's infidelity, and it would be the same here at the sight of Ned's supposed son. I actually think the hatred would be worse in this instance as well. Cersei was sent to freeze in the north, away from her brother, away from Casterly Rock, and court. The guy she was supposed to marry died, and she has to marry his less attractive brother, and to top it all off, said brother cheats on her. Cersei would be miserable, I would say. Miserable and angry. Ned would definitely be a good husband to Cersei. He would value her and honor her, and that might have been good if he hadn't brought Jon home and claimed that he was his son. It would definitely put distance between them, and I think she would treat Jon worse than Catelyn did. Considering that she threatened to kill Robert's illegitimate daughter, I think it would be the same here. Maybe she goes that far in threatening Jon's life as well. But in this case, I don't think she would really be able to do anything to Jon here, because she doesn't have that much influence in the north like she did in King's Landing. People wouldn't be lining up to take out Ned's kid. She could try to take matters into her own hands in that regard, but if she openly threatens Jon's life, I find it very easy to say that Ned would have kept Jon as far away from Cersei as possible and put him under constant guard to keep him safe. So this would be rough. I want to say that they would grow to care about each other, and while I do think her life with Ned would be much better than her life with Robert, things would still be strained between them, with Cersei so far from home, and Jaime, and her husband keeping his bastard son around for all to see. This would just be a marriage based on duty, and Cersei would feel humiliated all the time. Maybe there would be little hints that there could have been something more to this, but that's all there is. Hints that something that can never be. Regardless of what happens to their relationship though, Ned and Cersei will eventually have children. Maybe 3 like she had with Robert, or more accurately, Jaime. The oldest son of Ned and Cersei will be a boy named Robb. He won't be the same character he was in canon since he has a different mother though. He'll have dark hair like Ned. He has a younger brother whom we'll name Torrhen, since that's another cool Stark name that should get used more, and he has blonde hair like his mom. And then Ned and Cersei have a daughter named Joanna, after Cersei's mother, who some people say looks like a young Lyanna, and she also has darker hair. Robert and Catelyn will also have children as well. Considering that Catelyn had 5 kids in canon and Robert clearly has no issues popping them out, we'll say that they also have 5 kids in this timeline too, and since Baratheon genes are so strong, they'll all have black hair, so there's no doubt that they're Robert's kids in this timeline. They have 3 sons. The oldest is named Lionel, the second is named Boros, and the third is named Orys. They also have 2 daughters. The oldest is named Gwenys, and the youngest is named Sarah. With the birth of multiple legitimate Baratheon heirs and the removal of the Lannisters from court, this pretty much removes the conflict. The War of 5 Kings probably won't happen here since there won't be multiple claimants to the Iron Throne, and no one is going to hunt to expose the truth that the royal heirs are actually bastards, since they won't be in this timeline. Something that will remain the same though is Robert will still make his journey north to talk to Ned. Like canon, he'll seek a marriage proposal with the Starks and offer to marry his son Lionel to Ned's daughter Joanna. Like canon, Ned will accept, and assuming that Jon Arryn still died here, he'll also become the Hand of the King as well. Something that would be very interesting with the arrival of Robert to Winterfell is what happens between Jaime and Cersei. It would have been years since they've seen each other at this point, since Cersei has been in the north and not with Jaime while he served in the Kingsguard for over a decade now. Now we know their relationship, and with how unhappy Cersei would have been in the north, she definitely would try to seduce Jaime for old time's sake. Now, would Jaime accept is a different question. Yes, he loves Cersei, but a lot of this does come from many years of manipulation and having her as a constant presence in his life. With over a decade of no Cersei, would he even be eager to fall back into old patterns? I think he would, because that's what he did in the show, and in this timeline, he hasn't gone on that big humbling journey with Brienne that helps him mellow out a bit. There would just be a whirlwind of emotions when Cersei really starts coming on to him. They haven't seen each other in years, and that torrent of feelings that comes from long-lost siblings coming together after all this time apart could definitely drive them to do it. Especially if Cersei goes on about how terrible the North is and that Ned is a bad husband, and makes him want to comfort her. Now this also does beg the question of if they get caught like they did in canon. Say they go back to that tower to do the deed. Say Cersei's son Torrhen inherits that climbing affinity from Bran and fires them up there on his little escapade. It was already shocking to see the queen and her brother going at it, so imagine how he would feel seeing his mother and his uncle doing it. Fear of Pete doesn't even begin to describe what he would need in this scenario. And then imagine if they catch Torrhen before he can run off. They won't push him like they did Bran because this is Cersei's son now, and she loves her kid. So now she has to explain this to him and gaslight him into not telling anyone instead, which can make things really awkward as he weighs his options on whether or not to tell his father that his wife cheated, and the king that his Kingsguard broke its oath with his own sister. Then add in him wondering if he's a bastard since he's the only one of his siblings with blonde hair. But I will say he is Ned's son, because like I said earlier, Jaime has been in King's Landing for years up until this point, so there is no way he's Torrhen's father. This is definitely the foundation for an interesting story, but aside from that potential familial drama, I think this would pretty much be a fairly peaceful timeline. With no illegitimate Baratheons, there's no war for Robert's succession, especially if he lives longer since Cersei isn't his wife, and Catelyn won't be plotting to kill him. The Lannisters also don't have that much power at court either here, and Ned can probably live his life as an effective hand to Robert, since he doesn't have to deal with all these conspiracies about the crown and the children. Cersei may also try to go with Ned to King's Landing so she can be with Jaime more, but Ned will most likely force her to stay at Winterfell with their children, and she'll be left to brood. Other than that, I don't really see much happening in this timeline, at least at this point in the story, but it was an interesting one to think about. You guys let me know what changes you think would have also made sense for this timeline, but for now, I hope you all enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe for more videos, and I will see you all next time.